Meditations with Ryan Slomak.
Hello, listeners. Thanks for tuning in. This is the Meditations Podcast, and I am your host, Ryan Slomak. Welcome to episode 24. On today's episode, we are going to chill out with the one, the only Dean Haspiel. Dean is a New York City, more specifically Brooklyn-based cartoonist who makes a lot of work influenced by his time living in the city. He's also a playwright. He's also a master of Kickstarter. He's also an Emmy Award winner for an HBO show called Bored to Death. He's done a gazillion things, but he was kind enough to come on this show just to kind of clear the air and to educate people about his work in playwriting, because that's something that's not covered in a lot of his other publicity. So I'm interesting, or at least I think I am, but Dean is probably way more interesting than me. So without further ado, why don't we just jump into this? Here is Dean Haspiel. Just out of curiosity, what part of Brooklyn do you live in?
I live in Carroll Gardens, and my studio's in Red Hook. And just to give a brief sense of history, Carroll Gardens used to be a part of Red Hook. But Red Hook was kind of famously so tough. It was so tough that Al Capone had to go to Chicago to become Al Capone. In fact, I think he might have received his scar, Scarface, in Brooklyn. It was a pretty hardcore space. And then they built a highway kind of in between part of Red Hook, and then moved over a section, and then tried to market it as Carroll Gardens, where there are little gardens in front of buildings and whatnot. And this is a nicer space, but it's still, it's still kind of Red Hook in some ways, especially for the old school people. I mean, I grew up in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I was born in New York Hospital, and I didn't move to Brooklyn until about 27 years ago. This month, actually, about 27 years ago. I'll be 57 on Friday, May 31st. I moved here when I was 30. I remember, and I've said this before, I thought I knew everything I need to know about New York City until I moved to Brooklyn. And I learned a lot more stuff. And I also felt like at the time that I was kind of moving to the country, because I could hear quiet for the first time, but the quiet was kind of loud. Like there was this hum and this white noise that Manhattan has that is constant, that you could go to sleep to, kind of like the sound of a washing machine or something, but with sirens. But Brooklyn kind of like grabbed my heart in a lot of ways. It's a really cool space. And unfortunately these days, especially post-pandemic, are we post-pandemic? Technically, I guess we are.
Will we ever be? I don't know.
Right? I know. But it's so expensive. Like, it's probably cheaper to move back to Manhattan, And living as a cartoonist and a playwright who, doesn't make a dime on my plays, and just enough to survive on comics, and even that's starting to be compromised. I hope I can stay in Brooklyn, but we'll see what happens.
Thank you so much for kind of giving that overview of Brooklyn or whatever. I was just at the Brooklyn Paramount in downtown Brooklyn a few weeks ago for a show. And I always find that, people who live outside of New York City or people who live outside of Brooklyn think about it as one sort of like homogenous thing. Like, oh, it's New York and it's dirty and it's busy and all the opportunities there and it's expensive or whatever. But obviously there's these subcultures and these little just like niche places within New York, within Brooklyn, within Carroll Gardens, within Red Hook, within Crown Heights or whatever. I'm curious about like living in Carroll Gardens. How has that influenced you as a creator? You're so associated with Brooklyn to me as a creator. And I'm just curious about like how you have witnessed that sort of creative takeover.
Oh, well, I was doing a comic called Street Code at the time, which was me paying homage to Jack Kirby's singular memoir comic that's about 11 pages long called Street Code, where it's kind of like the origin of the Yancey Street Gang in some ways. A little young Jack Kirby kid that I've actually talked extensively about on the Jacked Kirby podcast, which was a lot of fun. But So I don't know. I feel like a New Yorker. I'm born and bred in New York. I live in Manhattan. I feel like that's true New York. I moved to Brooklyn, and it has a different feeling, a different vibe, and you would, yeah, Brooklyn sometimes is thrown is like considered, oh, a hipster town or something like that. And yes, there are areas that are kind of hipster, like Williamsburg and maybe even Dumbo. And my girlfriend has a studio in Dumbo. I have a shared studio in Red Hook. I live in Carroll Gardens. Uh, but it's also like it's not like California where what do they say? It's like 70 cities trying to find a state or something. I don't know. It like it's so many different spaces, right? But I feel like Brooklyn's starting to be a little bit like that, like Park Slope feels a little bit different from Prospect Heights. And, there are some areas that are more family oriented, like when I first moved to Carroll Gardens, it didn't feel as family oriented. It was very family in quotes, but you didn't see a lot of people pushing baby carts and, the 2.5 kids and a dog type thing, that was more Park Slope. And now Carroll Gardens, because people like me moved in and then you get married and have kids. I didn't do that, but a lot of people, my age, they're already putting their kids in college. My best friend moved a few blocks away, got married, had kids, and they're going to college now. But when I first moved here, it was very Italian and somewhat gangster. And there were precautions I wrote about in some of my comics. Again, the street code thing that later on I published as a graphic novel called Beef with Tomato, published by Alternative Comics, with some short stories. Things evolve and change, and then there's the idea of gentrification, right? And my feeling about it, and this is just a feeling, it's not fact, is, well, doesn't it also take the seller? Don't we also blame the seller? Like there, people with money can come in and buy things and change and alter, the energy and the vibe of a neighborhood and the culture. But it takes two to tango. So like I think a lot of old school people here were just like, I'm out, I'm done. I want to sell my space. They didn't want to hand it down to a family member or something like that. So they're selling to people that are the highest bidder, right? And so it changes and evolves spaces. Listen, my New York City doesn't exist anymore the way I grew up. Okay. And what does my mean? Choose your poison. It's like, when you think about, I don't know how old you are, but like you'll notice that some of your favorite restaurants are going away. That comic shop or that music store or whatever it is that we used to do when we were younger to get our culture before the internet are gone. Most of that is gone. And that's how you hung out and met people and formed your own tribes, right? So in a weird way, I think of Brooklyn as being tribal, right? And that's kind of what I write about. These little these cliques that are formed, right? But that's true anywhere, I think, you know?
Yeah, can I ask like I think that's a really interesting point, just the idea that I mean part of the thing of aging is like realizing that the world is changing around you while you're probably changing at a slower rate,
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
a very strange experience, but like if Brooklyn is tribal, like how would you describe the tribe that you have found there?
Well, the tribe that I found, and I would say we're lousy with them, and I say lousy, I mean a lot. It's cartoonists. Like I formed a bunch of studios. I did it online through a webcomics collective called Activate in the mid 2000s that ran for a good few years and then kind of petered out. Um, but yeah, like all the artists are working at home, you know, never leaving the house for 3 or 4 days at a time. And then you start to talk to other artists. You're like, you know what? How much would it cost to find a spot and then go to work and feel like you're leaving the house and experiencing some street culture, and not just ordering in or doing takeout or cooking food, but like actually expanding your horizons in some ways. So I think I got to move around because of other cartoonists wanting to congregate and be in the same room. And of course, then, you got a bunch of artists together, or even when I go to like a residency like Yaddo, it gets real high school really fast. Like everyone is a sensitive baby, and a brat at the same time. So but still, like to find like-minded artists is important because, you're not doing real work or a real job according to society, and it's hard to do something. Howard Chaykin calls becoming a cartoonist a calling, and I call it a curse sometimes. So it's a calling and a curse. Uh, and so I think that's what I found. But also it was important, like when I worked with Harvey Pekar on American Splendor and the graphic novel The Quitter, and then when he passed away, Entertainment Weekly asked me to write and draw a comic, kind of like for his obituary in the magazine. And I had to think about what was Harvey Pekar for me. And I think what I love best about Harvey Pekar is, and for your listeners, Harvey Pekar spent like more than half of his life writing about his life and working with artists like R. Crumb and me and Josh Neufeld and Joe Sacco and a ton of all kinds of artists, and would publish memoir comics called American Splendor. The thing that I got most from Harvey was his ear, the fact that he listened. And in listening, he was almost like a journalist in a way. Not only was he writing about himself, but often he was imparting what other people were saying as well, as long as it was of his interest to publish that kind of stuff, right? And he also loved jazz, and I think that there's something about jazz lovers that are also very open-minded to all kinds of thought and theory and ideas, and experimentation. And so, like, I was able to kind of like work with him, learn about paying attention to what's happening around you. I sometimes think that if I wasn't a cartoonist, I'd be a cop, but the problem is I'd probably go to jail for shooting people because I'm afraid of what I either would shoot no one or I'd shoot everyone. I have no idea, and I don't want to find out.
We'll keep firearms away from you, Dean.
Yeah, thank you very much. But I've had lots of ideas of how to use the concept of a gun in stories. In fact, if I get to do another longer Red Hook story, it involves the power of a gun and one bullet.
Well, let's before we jump into your sort of themes and whatever, I find the idea that I mean, first of all, thank you for acknowledging that the cartoonist life can very much be a lonely one. I think it's something that's not really talked about a lot. But the thing that I think is interesting about you is that like your your cartooning journey kind of started in finding these studios and becoming a part of them. You had worked with Howard Chaykin when he was working on American Flag. You worked with Bill Sienkiewicz when he was doing New Mutants and Elektra Assassin, right? And you worked with Dennis Cohen, who I just adore. So like, what were the
Walter Simonson on Thor?
Yeah, Walt Simonson. I knew I was forgetting a big one. Thank you. When you were a youth and an assistant to these individuals who the comics market was very different. It was booming in the late 80s. Like what was the culture like in those spaces versus what was the culture that you look for now when you're creating studio spaces with other people?
I mean, that's a good question because I feel that, especially pandemic, post-pandemic, I don't know anymore. And I can talk about the differences of what it was like to work in studios before the pandemic, during and after, right? So in 1985, I was 17 going on 18. It was my senior year of high school. I had been going to Harlem to music and art, and then music and art got married to performing arts, AKA the Fame School, right? Right behind Lincoln Center, right next to Martin Luther King High School. And that was 1985. And my really good friend, Larry O'Neill, who's the son of Denny O'Neill, infamous is a bad term, famous writer, editor of DC and Marvel comics, right? And his son, Larry, went to high school with me, and he got wind that, Chaykin needed an assistant. So Larry became his assistant. Then down the hall, Bill Sienkiewicz wanted an assistant. So I got to become Bill Sienkiewicz's assistant. And then there's Walt Simonson, Jim Sherman, Dennis Cowan, Michael Day, a whole bunch of people, right? And then I started working for 3 different guys. And that was a very heady experience. So in some ways, that experience of being kind of like an apprentice, an assistant, 17 going on 18 with my own ideas of comics. And during a time where I'm going to art school And comics are shunned by a lot of the fine art teachers. They would look at me and go, "That's not art. What are you doing?" Little do they respect and understand that it's a multimedia art form. Comics, it incorporates so many different things in order to create a comic. As innate as it is to draw and write comics as a child or as a an old person, as a, it does require all kinds of things to think about in order to achieve a well-made comic. But having said that, I let Howard Chaykin moved to California. Walt Simonson moved to Suffern, New York, and the studio kind of like evaporated. And it was I had to move on as well because I needed to write and draw my own comics, and I worked with other writers, and I didn't feel confident about writing back then because I didn't feel like I was a writer until I started to realize after many years, drawing comics is writing because you're choosing, you're co-authoring with the writer because you're choosing certain things to show and how to show it. And the writer is relying on the artist. And because it's a visual medium first, there's a lot of storytelling going on in the artwork. So little by small, I started to realize maybe I should try writing as well, and I think the purest form of comics, and I've done it a few times, is when you draw it first or you lay it out, the idea, and then you add script. Okay. And I just mean script and dialogue or text. But yeah, the idea of story is constantly, developing itself as you're drawing, as you're writing, and what do you take out in the art or put in the art, or what do you take out or put in with the actual text, but then, I go to college, I come back, I want to be autonomous, not live at home anymore. And then, I'm starting to live with other people, and I'm trying to find a little spot for my art table, and I'm making comics while doing part-time jobs to make, to get by and pay rent and bills. And then I think it was around 2000 or 2001, I got the opportunity to work on a 4-issue miniseries from Marvel. It was a Thing miniseries from the Fantastic Four with writer Evan Dorkin. And I had started an idea, but I didn't know how to finish it. So I went to Evan, and Evan came up with a great idea, and we were able to sell it to Marvel. And we worked on that for about a year, and I took the leap. I quit my part-time job. I was in Brooklyn, and I took the leap of going full-time freelance, making comics. And that was around, I want to say 2000, 2001. And all these years later, hand over fist, my friend, constantly trying to, make ends meet in the freelance life. But what I did discover was like, I couldn't stand being at home alone all the time. So there was this blogging platform called LiveJournal. Okay. And so a bunch of my friends who had moved to California went on LiveJournal. I was able to keep tabs with them. But then I discovered other artists locally. And I was like, wait a second, why don't we form kind of like a little online studio, but also create a physical studio? So I think it was in, I want to say 2006, I launched Activate, a webcomics collective, but also formed a studio with like 5 other artists in Gowanus. And that Gowanus is basically adjacent to Red Hook and Carroll Gardens, and is like the connector to like Park Slope and stuff like that. So, but not a very well-regarded place. It has a famous like canal that they bury the bodies in, and there's syphilis in the water. And I've written about Gowanus as well. But so we formed studios, and yeah, there was something really great and energizing about going to a studio with other artists, and they're creating completely different things than I am, and being able to have the conversation and be also to rally each other. Because what would happen is you get to the studio, I don't want to draw, I don't want to do anything, I want to hang out. Oh, I'm looking outside, there's the sun. What do people do when they're outside, kind of thing. And then you turn around and you see three artists with their nose down at the art table, penciling or drawing or whatever. You're like, okay, they're doing it, I got to do it, right? And then you find the space and you get inside the zone, as it were, right? And I've had several studios like that. I left this one studio called Deep Six that was in Gowanus, and then I went over to Cobble Hill and I started something called Hang Die with a bunch of other cartoonists. And every time you'd have a studio, it wasn't just the space. You try to like do things with each other, projects. maybe an anthology, or you're doing something online together. At Hang Dai, I co-created another web collective called Trip City, right? But instead of just being comics, it was podcasts and articles and all kinds of different things, writing, pictures, and sometimes video, and it kept expanding because I realized I'm not just a cartoonist, I'm a story maker, right? And that'll lead to plays later on, right? So, I was in Hang Dai for a little while, and then what happened next? I think we lost that space, and then we were back in our homes for a while. And even when we were back home, I like one or two of my studio mates would come to my house and work, or I might go to their house or something, right? And then finally we found another space, and then in the other space, what was cool about it was a proper studio in a warehouse where there was like 100 rooms with painters and sculptors and all kinds of different artists, not just cartoonists. So we found a room there, uh, and I mean, I'm jumping all over the place, but the point is, like, I have formed many studios with many different people, and that have come and go. Some were I've developed really good friendships with. Some people I'll never speak to again. Just like life. Like that's what happens. And my current studio situation is in Red Hook, and I share it with Whitney Matheson, who's an incredible writer, and she does her own diary comics, daily diary comics, and a guy named Jason Gungor, who's Australian, who is working on a project right now, and we are moving into a room finally now with windows, because we've been in a room with no windows for about 3 years. And as cool as it is to get out of the house, at least at home, as you can see my face right now, I'm all lit up by light from my living room windows. When I leave here, I'm going to go into a dark room, you know? So I'm looking forward to being around light again for mental health reasons alone. But at this other space, the previous space, during the pandemic, there were 12 spots that 12 cartoonists that rented this room. Okay. And in fact, I think it was technically 14 cartoonists, because I think two of the tables were shared. Okay. So the potential to have 12 to 14 cartoonists was always there at one time, which is very robust and energizing and almost schizophrenic, to be honest, right? And when the pandemic happened, everyone stayed home, and all these art tables became like parking spots, and it was eerie, and it was a scary time because people were dying, and there was a truck down my block, because I have a what do you call it, a funeral home on the corner, that just was running 24 hours, a cold ice truck with bodies in it, and it got really, really harrowing and spooky, and it just challenged you in every way, the pandemic. Because as much as we love a good pandemic movie, you don't want to be in one in real life, And who knew? Were zombies going to come? I don't know, right? So, but I do remember that, like, I had no setup at home. All my creative setup was at the studio. And I biked every day, and there was almost no one on the streets. I go to an empty building and would draw by myself to try to finish a deadline on a project, right? And I remember about 2 months in, I heard like footsteps on another floor, but it was almost like being in a hidden attic. And like the footsteps were like, are they coming to get me? Is it another survivor? Like, what's going on, And the only other person I really saw besides my girlfriend was Whitney, who also was, and once in a while she would come by and we'd be wearing masks, or she'd come to say hi or whatever, because you craved humanity again, even though we're all locked down, So that was a really scary time.
Well, I want to talk about, like, one thing that I think is really interesting about you is that there's, the word cartoonist is often an independent term. It's the idea that you are a writer, you are artist, and you're somebody who's always hungry for collaboration. These studio spaces, two things come to mind. One is that it's a living and breathing example of your passion for collaboration, which I just think is really cool. And then the second thing is, there's like studies that have shown that, like, you're kind of the amalgamation of the people you spend time with. And when you're surrounding yourself with people who are all right, we're going to become the best that we can in this cartooning phase. And you've got 7, 12, 14 people around you. Maybe not everybody's going to be successful at that, but you enhance your chances of creating strong work because you have so many unintentional editorial moments within those spaces.
I mean, you nailed it. That's basically what's happening is you have access to other ideas, other thoughts, other jobs. Like I would get a call for a job and either I didn't want to do it or I couldn't do it. And I'd be like looking around the room and go, how can I get someone some work? And vice versa, like that is helpful. But again, just sensibilities, it's like expanding your own ideas of what is a story or how to draw something just by looking at other people doing stuff differently. And like even in social media, like there's so many people who spend so much time turning people off and flinging crap at each other. And I get it, there's a lot of anger to be dispersed and a lot of things to be discussed and criticized and changed. But what I try to do is turn you on, and I try to show you things that I like. And in doing that, it means not just talking about me, and look what I'm doing, but look at what that person's doing, or she, or he, or them, or they, or whatever. Like, and because to me that is a part of who I am, is community. I think like community recommends you, as best as possible. Warts and all, because we are human and we do falter and we're complicated and make mistakes. And that's a whole other conversation, is the whole like redemption and giving people second chances, and I mean good people or people who make mistakes. And like, that's being human, because what's starting to happen more than ever before is people are growing up in public. The minute you get online, anything you say or do, somebody can isolate that and throw it back at you years later. And it needs context. And I think that's important, context. And I think some of the future writings I might do might incorporate some of those ideals.
And it's easy to be anonymous. It's always easy to be
Oh my
anonymous,
God, I
right?
can't stand it. That's why I put my name on everything, you know? And actually being being a communication artist, let's call it, as a cartoonist, and communicating your art, whether it's through comics, theater, Substack, Facebook, Instagram, it does start to teach you how to communicate smarter, better, uh, maybe even pithier because of the ADD culture, everyone's attention span. Because it's almost that you're not competing for people's money, you're competing for their time, you know? But yeah, it's if you want to make a living, we also have to figure that out, and it's constantly changing and evolving how to make a living at this. And it's rough.
Well, you've made a living in some really interesting ways, and what a collaboration that I kind of forgotten about, but before I was doing research on you, is that you did a graphic novel called The Alcoholic with Jonathan Ames,
Oh yeah.
right? Comes out with Vertigo in 2008, if I understand correctly. It's sort
Yeah.
of semi-autobiographical, but it's Jonathan Ames, who I think is a novelist and a screenwriter, who that this was his first graphical collaboration. Like you were his like kind of gateway drug into like learning how to make comics. What was that process like for kind of helping somebody on the tracks of the comics medium?
So I feel like first of all, the thing about Jonathan is he's a Renaissance man. Like the minute you show him how to make a comic, he's got it. He was great. He was easy. There are some people who don't know anything about making comics, and that's fair. And they come from other disciplines, right? Whether they're a painter or maybe they're even a screenwriter and don't know how to write a comic, because it is different. There are different, modes of writing, and comics isn't as easy as it looks. But for Jonathan, it came pretty easy. The way I met Jonathan was like my friend Bob Fingerman, who's another cartoonist, turned me on to his writing. And Jonathan used to write a regular column, let's say, for New York Press, which was a free weekly, newspaper that I would get. And he was very funny. And then he had published some collections. And Bob Fingerman used to read some of his stories to me over the phones because it was like that funny and irreverent. And then, so I was getting into his stuff when I was at a local coffee shop near where I live, and it's Jonathan Ames. And he had like a basketball in his hand, and he was sweating. It was like, he had just played basketball or something. And I'm not shy when it comes to like meeting people that I admire. I just feel like I can walk up to them. I'm not asking for their money or autograph. I just want to shake their hand and say thank you. Thank you for entertaining me, for bringing some kind of light into my life or whatever, or understanding about humanity. And so I went right up to him, and within like 20 minutes, we're already like, hitting it off. He actually wrote about our meeting in the 10th anniversary edition of The Alcoholic, published by Berger Books. Karen Berger, who was the, who created Vertigo. We got friendly, got his number. Part of our conversation, I actually had some of my comic books on me, and I gave him some of my comics. And he used to read Marvel comics when he was younger. He has cited how when he was reading Avengers and the Korvac saga kind of disappointed him, because I think Korvac kills all the Avengers and then something happens where they all get resurrected and they come back to life. Of course, you're not going to kill the Avengers, but that was about as close as it got back then. And he was kind of remembering how dramatic it was and intense. And then he felt such disappointment, not because he wants the Avengers dead, but it just felt like an easy out or whatever. I forget the whole storyline. But anyway, we connected on comics. We connected on a sense of humor and storytelling. And then little by small, we'd hang out. And then at some point, I had done The Quitter, and which was, semi-autobiographical. And I was trying to convince Jonathan, why don't we come up with an idea and try to sell it to Vertigo? And we had a meeting with Jonathan Vankin, who was my editor on The Quitter, and then became the editor on The Alcoholic. And that launched into a year and maybe a year and a half long collaboration where our friendship now had a job, like we were working together on stuff. And we were firing on all cylinders. And I was bringing my A game, and he was kind of doing this semi-autobiographical thing that has some truths in it, and it came out. And that's the weird thing. Like, DC, I got to applaud DC Comics for trying and attempting to do indie comics like in the vein of Fantagraphics and Drawn and Corley and Top Shelf, right? So, like, they were publishing non-superhero stuff. I mean, starting with Vertigo, with fantasy, Sandman, that kind of stuff, Fables, other kind of really interesting kind of experimental comics in other genres that weren't just superhero, including memoir and semi-autobiographical comics. And then I did 3 of those. I did another one called Cuba My Revolution with Inverno Lopez, who's a painter. But and that was a fun collaboration as well. And all collaborations are different. Like with Harvey Pekar and The Quitter, once we settled on what it was going to be about, he wrote essentially a 62-page document of just stick figures talking. That's it. That's all I got. So it was mostly the text of the comic, and I had to parse that out and lay it out and turn that into a 96-page graphic novel. With Jonathan Ames, page 1, panel 1, action, dialogue, whatever, right? He grasped it pretty quickly, and I don't think there was that many changes, to be honest. In fact, we had to add 10 pages. And with Inverno Lopez, she had never written a comic book ever. I don't even know what she'd probably written essays and stuff like that. And she was telling a really intense life story. And I know she had help with that, including our editor on that project, Joan Hilty. So we all kind of collaborated together to make that story work, But to me, I always learn from collaboration because I'm drawing things I would never have assigned myself. I'm trying to service the story. That's an important thing to learn. Not only service the story for someone else's vision or the collaborative vision, but then you apply that to yourself. What is the best way to fully exploit your own idea visually and in text, and trying to find that sweet spot, that marriage, instead of being lazy about it. And I'm telling you, the layout section, once you know what the story is and you're laying it out, that is comics. After that, it's all craft. Then you're like taking it to the page and you're drawing the figures and inking and coloring and lettering and arranging it and trying to make it work as best as possible. But the essential thumbnails, those layouts, is what comics is to me, to the point where I hope somehow in the future I could try and turn those layouts into being my comics, meaning not going much more than that, and let that be like a fine art kind of comic style. but I think it would require the right story in order to crack that.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to Jonathan Ames for one more second because I feel
Yeah.
like there's just a brilliant moment of life imitating art, imitating life, where Jonathan Ames later creates a TV show called Bored to Death. That there's a certain character on it played by Zach Galifianakis named Ray Houston, who rumor has it is partially based on one person I'm interviewing named Dean Haspiel.
So yes, so Jonathan wrote a short story called Bored to Death, which was great. But it basically featured the Jonathan Ames protagonist, right? And there was a producer who believed that she could, with Jonathan Ames, turn it into a TV show, but he needed to have a couple more characters in order to bounce off of. And one of those characters was loosely based on me, a cartoonist, who would later be cast, to be portrayed by Zach Galifianakis. And I provided all the comic book artwork for the character. And I also helped, I designed the characters for the opening credit sequence that then we won Emmys for. And so I have an Emmy for working on HBO's Bored to Death with Jonathan Ames, and it ran 3 seasons. He had already plotted out a 4th season when it got unfortunately canceled. I hope that someday they make a movie or something and return to those characters. We made comic books that went to San Diego Comic-Con and New York Comic-Con, and people dress up like Super Ray. The name of the Ray Houston character was Super Ray. A little known fact: Ray Houston, the Houston part of the name, which is spelled Hueston, is my best friend's last name, Mike Houston, who was another guy when I was hanging with Larry O'Neill, was a budding cartoonist who later on would become a criminal defense lawyer. And also got friendly with Jonathan Ames. So Jonathan paid homage to him by giving him his last name. But yeah, that was so much fun. And going on set, I purposely avoided Zach about the first year of the first season because I wanted him to create his own persona and not base it on me at all. So if you've talked to me for 5 minutes and you've seen that characterization, very different, but there was some backstory that was loosely based, again, in the loosely based department, that came from my life. So that's, it was a lot of fun to see that and to hang out with those people and be in that environment, because as much as I love comic books, one of the things I wanted to do was write and direct films. And actually went to SUNY Purchase and college. And the first 2 years I was in art classes and didn't really like art classes. And again, came up against the usual comics that aren't real art type thing. But then you'd find other cartoonists at the college and you hang out with them. And then you provide comics for the local, college newspaper. But then I decided, you know what? I want to transition to film because guess what? Storytelling. And I love sound and I love moving images and pictures and acting and that kind of stuff. And I guess, I don't know if you want to enter this part of the conversation, but the first play I wrote, what came from a screenplay. So,
And was
I don't know if you have,
that Switch to Kill?
yeah. So Switch to Kill was a screenplay I wrote, I don't know, years before the play was ever made. And there were basically 2 parts to the screenplay. And one involved a lot more like car chases and, more cinematic stuff. But I had a good chunk, I'd say about 70 pages of the screenplay that, were people basically, talking to each other and pointing guns and in bars and whatnot, right? And I was like, well, maybe this could be a play. And the reason why I thought about being a play is I went to another cartoonist's wedding, Riley Brown. Riley Brown, who's done Deadpool and recently did a webtoon comic called Outrage. Really great cartoonist and artist. And he was getting married, and I was sitting at a table with Fred Van Lente, who's a comic book writer, great comic book writer, and his
Who
wife.
graduated from Syracuse University, I'll point out.
Oh wow, check it out! Hey,
FYI.
nice. And his wife, Crystal Skillman. And I was sitting with them and we were talking and I said something. I mean, Crystal's a playwright. And I was like, oh, I always wanted to write a play, or I've kind of gotten some screenplays. And she got me hip to a thing that was happening at the Brick Theater in Williamsburg, that there was going to be this festival where basically they were going to produce plays by cartoonists or comic book writers or whoever, right? Like Fred had written something. Uh, Adam McGovern, who's a friend of mine, who's a comic book writer as well, had written something, and a few other people. I think Arsa Koriak did something, and they were like, "Why don't you submit something and see if it gets in?" So I dusted off this, Switch to Kill screenplay I wrote that, in retrospect, I realized is more play than it was cinematic, because I was able to, isolate a whole story out of it. I submitted it, and this guy named Ian W. Hill, who's a fantastic kind of avant-garde writer and director, dug it, and then decided to direct and produce it for this festival. And I became an inadvertent playwright because of this process. And I remember going to all 4 shows of this production of Switch to Kill, and I got bitten by the bug, man. Like, what? Like, he was able to turn my words, because he's one of those guys who honors the playwright kind of thing. And maybe it could have used some editing, I don't know, but I was able to see my words be performed and acted and come to life, and I was like, oh my god. So that was the first one, Switch to Kill.
Well, let's
And
let's
then,
let's just stay there
yeah,
for a second, because I think
sure.
that there's a lot of people who view story from a purist nature. I have written a short story; it will remain a short story. I mean, even a few episodes ago on this podcast, I interviewed somebody who was a science fiction writer who shout out to Andy Looney, but interviewed him, and he wrote this short story, and in the short story there was a game, and somebody read the short story and said, but what's the game? And now they own a very thriving board game company
Oh
because
wow.
of this sort of like willingness to transition things. And
Right.
I just think it's important to kind of just take a second to talk about this part, which is, as a creative, there's so many times where you say, I'm writing the screenplay because this is going to become a movie and I'm going to have the resources for it. And then sometimes, we always say, like, you make art, you let it go. Once it's in the universe, it's something else. But there is sort of a purgatory for art where you've made a thing and you're not 100% sure if it's communicated effectively, if it's in the right form, if it's found the right audience, and feeling liberated to say, hey, here's my screenplay, here's a new venue for it, here's a way to send it to the theater, is something that not all artists can allow themselves to do. And I'm curious about, like, what was your process of going back to your screenplay and saying, all right, I need to now think about this in regards to actors on stage, lighting grids, how a director is going to handle this, temporality, how much time do I have to communicate this story? It's going to be in Brooklyn. What does that audience know? Like, how did you sort of go through that sort of self-editing process to take it to the stage?
Well, that self-editing process probably came after this play, because this play was a lark. Like, in other words, I didn't think about any of that stuff. What you just mentioned, what do you mean lighting grids? I'm not thinking lighting grids, like, are you kidding me? All I thought about was, and was, will this work on the stage? And it wasn't my say, it was Ian W. Hill deciding that he could make it work. He could have rejected it, but because what I understood and what I discovered was I had not written a screenplay, I had written a play, right? And except for a portion of the story, about 30 pages that I had to exercise. And so there's one character that's mentioned in lore throughout the entire play that you never see. And in a weird way, that works better for the character because he becomes more mythological and legendary. Like, everyone it's called Switch to Kill. It's not in Brooklyn, although it's Brooklyn adjacent. It's in a made up world where everyone has a secret identity and everyone's like a hitman or a guns and ammunition. It's kind of like an abstract of Reservoir Dogs in some ways, okay? Which I would like. Who wasn't a Tarantino fan back in the 90s? I mean, even today, I'm a huge Tarantino fan. And in fact, I would hazard that a lot of his screenplays are plays, to be honest. Like, The Hateful Eight is a play. I mean, come on. There's cinematic qualities to it, obviously, but you could do that as a play. Anyway, but in terms of honoring a story and format, I absolutely think about that all the time. I always think about, why is this a comic? How is this a comic? How is this a play? Why is it a play? How is it a movie? Why is it a movie? And I've actually made a short film that had a certain constraints to it, but I was trying to figure out, if I'm making this as a movie, why is it a movie, a short film? how are you using the space to take advantage of the space, right? Um, and I feel like some people will write a screenplay and try to turn it into a graphic novel, but it takes a cartoonist to make it a graphic novel, not necessarily the screenplay writer, okay, unless they're versatile, right? So you have to think about these things in order to honor and serve the format, okay? So when I went to write the second play, now I'm thinking about how is this theater? Why is it theater? Even with my limited understanding and working with Ian W. Hill again, on a thing I wrote called Harry Carey Kane that was originally inspired by a friend I went to college with named Phil Cruz. Phil Cruz is an actor, but he was also a director and a producer. And he had seen, I guess, Switch to Kill, and we hadn't seen each other in years, and we kind of rekindled a friendship. And he was like, "Why don't we make something?" But in the development of it, he realized that he wasn't going to be able to raise the funds necessary, and so we handed the directorial chores over to Ian W. Hill. By the way, that's a street cleaner, uh, a Brooklyn street cleaner. Oh, we're good. Okay, I don't know if you guys can hear that. So then so I wrote this other play that again came from another defunct kind of idea that I wasn't going to turn into a comic, that I thought would maybe be a screenplay, but turned out to be more of a play, right? So the second one, Harry Carey Kane, also was appeared at the Brick Theater with no, I don't think anybody. Oh, except for one person, maybe two people were in the first cast. So it was again another incredible experience of seeing my words come to life, be performed. It was a little more ambitious than Switch to Kill because it had certain things like tearing out people's hearts and and whatnot. It was a little crazy. Um, it was about death and the dregs of immortality and very existential crisis type stuff. I think that's something I veer into a lot. In fact, I've been experiencing it with a computer meltdown lately. Um, but and that did that have any Brooklyn in it? That had a little bit of Brooklyn in it as well. It also had like a mountain in it. It starts off with someone climbing a mountain. A lot of metaphor. I love metaphor. And I'm not going to just get into the plot or the story, the nuts and bolts of the story, but every time you do something, you always learn from it. Even the current comic that I'm writing and drawing is teaching me how to make the next comic even better. And even though one could hazard that I'm a veteran of comics, I feel like I'm always learning, constantly learning, to the point where all I ever see are my mistakes. And I'm sure if I allowed myself, I could, applaud the things that work. But I don't know, sometimes it feels like that's by accident these days, like, but and when I write plays, I'm not making any money on these things, it's really a passion project, and you have to collaborate because I can't make these plays on my own.
Totally. And I guess what I'm curious about is like, there's an element of like kid in a candy store when you see your work come to life.
Right.
And I'm curious about, how much when you're seeing, Harakari Kane or Switch to Kill, we'll talk about The Last Bar at the End of the World and War of Wu shortly. But like when you're seeing these plays happening, especially early on, which, 2014, it was a decade ago. It wasn't that long ago
Right.
when you first started seeing these plays, like were you able to just take a step back and just enjoy the process, or are you looking at it from this sort of like creative technical lens where you're deconstructing what you would do differently or how you would put words, on a page different for a director to interpret?
I think that you can't help but like deconstruct or like some things or not like other things. But at the end of the day, the idea that it takes a village, when I was in SUNY Purchase and I transitioned to film school, the film portion of the school, they would sometimes have invite actors and directors to lecture. And Alan Arkin, one of my favorite actors of all time, came. And I think he showed a film, and for the life of me, I can't remember what the film was. Uh, and he showed it, and he was very self-deprecating, very funny, as the nature of a lot of his acting is. And he wrote a couple of really great books about improv and memoir slash improv books that you should check out. And he made some joke about how back then, if you made a 90-minute movie, and the movie was in focus, meaning you could see the film, you could get another job directing, right? And so like it kind of like took away some of the magic and some of the ideas of perfection. So when I would see these plays, and we're talking about black box theater, like 50 to 75 people sitting at best, watching a play that's very kind of lo-fi, low, and so it's very forgiving in a lot of ways, right? If somebody misses a line or whatever, or they mess up or whatever, it's part of the nature, I think, in some way of those kinds of plays. If it happens on Broadway and you spend $200 on a ticket, you could get maybe a little pissed off or whatever. But like it was just the idea of it takes a village. So I never really felt like, oh my God, this is a disaster, or oh, this could be so much better if I could direct it, kind of thing. Because I have an ego, but I didn't have that kind of ego, right? And so I was constantly just enjoying the fact that someone believed in me enough, or several people believed in me enough to devote their time to help uplift and make something, together. And I'm very aware of that as a creator, in any medium. So like for me, what the takeaway though is it encouraging me to want to direct myself? And I'm talking about theater. I've always wanted to direct movies, and and I have made a couple of short films, but I haven't done my movie yet. Right? Will I get to before the end of my life? I don't know. Will it be a regret? Absolutely, if I don't get to do it. So I think I need to, but I never thought about directing theater. And it wasn't until I wrote a new play that I started thinking, oh, maybe I'll direct this one. Maybe this is the one, but we can get to that. So, but the idea that it takes a village, is very forgiving, is what I get out of these experiences. And also ultimately the audience. Are you kidding me? When the audience laughs together or gasps together, or you get a couple of funny reactions. And it was my more recent play, The War Woo, that I had started to build into the script areas of story that I was hoping that maybe even people would get up and leave because they were like, what is going on right now? And to me, that's kind of a sense of black humor, like dark humor kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think it's interesting too, where it's like part of the reason that you were so kind to have this interview was the fact that we could just talk about theater, and it was nice. It's nice to, one of the biggest problems I have with you, Dean, is that everything you do is so cool, and I want to talk about all of it. And
oh, thank you.
when I look at your sort of arc as a comic artist, and okay, people are looking at me because I my dream of doing Fantastic Four has come to light, and now I can move on to the next thing. Like, it's interesting to see what jobs you take, and we'll talk about your sort of movement in Kickstarter at the end of the
Sure.
show. But it's interesting to see your arc there, and then also looking at your theater arc. There's people who write plays for 50 years and never have a single one of them produced.
Mhm.
And, you had 2014 Switch to Kill, which is just like, here's an opportunity, we can do it. Your second one, 2017, you have Stoya, who's like part of the cast.
Mhm.
Your next one in 2018, Stoya again returns. You got Seth Gilliam, who's known from the Walking Dead TV
And The
show.
Wire,
And
and I think Oz. He's a great actor. We went to college with him, and he's really good pals with Phil Cruz. And Phil Cruz, who helped inspire me to do my second play, then went on to direct and my third and fourth plays, and produce them. And Seth Gilliam is I mean, we worked around his schedule because he's popular and he gets some good TV gigs or movies or whatever, and he's such a great actor. Like there's a moment there's a scene in my third play, The Last Part of the World, that he crushes with another actor named Tarek Davis. That again, I'm not going to get into the scene or the plot of the play, but like just moments like that where everything transcends and becomes another thing, like where art turns into, I don't know, like some kind of power, like and it touches your soul, and you can feel that from the audience, and even as the writer, and everyone knows that this scene is coming up, and there's a moment, and it still works. It's kind of like when you watch a movie for the second and third and fourth or the 100th time, because every time there's a couple of things that happen that transports you, even though you know it's coming. You know, uh, it's stuff like that. That's the reward. That's the currency. That's the money. That money doesn't matter. We have money to pay for bills and to get things, right? But that's what that transaction is. That the soul of theater can the thing that's crazy about theater is that it evaporates instantly as it's happening, but only it's what your heart and mind take away, because there isn't a record of it. You know, what's great about movies is I can show it to you and show it to at any time, anywhere you can access it, and that's cool. And there's a power to that, because, there's a record of it, right? But there's no record of the theater except for pictures. And yeah, my friend films these plays, but it doesn't capture really anything of what it's like to sit in that audience, for better or for worse. So I don't know. That to me is undeniable. And it's almost like, when a comedian says the reason why they went back to do more comedy was because of that first time they made people laugh in a room, and they're trying to capture that. It's the same idea in some way.
Well, I love it. And I guess what I wanted to point out is that, you have an upward trajectory on your playwriting career, even though people don't look at you as a playwright. I mean, to sit there and say like, sure, I'll do a favor for Dean. I guess we'll do this little thing. Great. And then this was a really awesome experience. I'm gonna come back from doing a Walking Dead movie or whatever to
I
like
know.
do
I
a
know.
Dean Haspiel play is really cool. Your most recent one was War of Woo, and one of the things I wanted to clarify is that it looks like that play was supposed to go live right in the middle of the pandemic.
So it was slated to debut or mount, whatever you call it, mid-March 2020. And that week they were shuttering theater, done, like no more theater. And we're like, wait a second, but wait, hold up, we're raising our hand here. Wait, and nope, donezo. And that's after all that prep work and putting it together and securing a theater. And again, I'm not doing any of that kind of heavy lifting at all. That was Phil Cruz and his crew and staff and the actors, and all giving and devoting all their energy and talent and time, and suddenly be told, nope, we're not going to do it. And by the way, we didn't know how long it was going to last. Was it going to be a month, 2 months? And then we'll get right back to it. No, it was 2 years later. And if you think about it, that's astounding, because again, they came up with a vaccine within like a year, whatever it was. Like, and is that vaccine even like, is it problematic? Who knows? I've gotten 5 shots or whatever. Like, maybe I'm a Frankenstein monster now. I don't know, but I did what I had to do, and so it didn't mount until about 2 years later, and we lost. I think Stoya was going to be in that one, but then she moved to another country, and we got this other great actress, and who plays God, actually. Olivia played God. Yeah, no. So the War of Woo. Actually, if you want to hear something interesting, so I had written a different play. So after The Last Bar at the End of the World, we were like, let's do something again, and so I kind of went back to the drawing board and came up with an idea that was nagging at me. And I wrote it, and we did 2 readings, and I threw it in a drawer. I was like, there's some parts of this I like, and I think I know what I'm doing here, or I'm trying to get at something. And the other part, all right, speaking about serving like a format or a story for the theater or a story for comedy, whatever, it felt like I was writing an essay. I wasn't writing a play. And sometimes you'll see any kind of work and you'll feel like they're not using the power of that format or that medium or that form, right? They're just trying to write an essay through, or they're trying to like clobber you with a message. And that's something I've also been learning, because we all have kind of messages or things you want to impart or say, but you got to nuance it. You got to be able to figure out how to get it into someone's mind, and not necessarily convince them, but them at least think about what you're trying to say, and that's something I look for as well in story now, is I'll start to see, okay, I think I know where they're going with this. but are they really just going to double down on that and clobber me in the head, or are they going to nuance it, this idea, you know? So I realized that I had veered into the wrong direction, and I hated it, and I threw it in the drawer. And then I had this other idea that ultimately became the War of Wu, which was completely different than the other idea. So I don't know, I can't even remember the origin of the War of Wu or how I was coming up with an idea. I think I was kind of like, sometimes what I like to do is challenge myself, is I'll write an idea to me so that I can respond to it the next day. Does that make sense? Like I'm trying to mess with myself. And so I started to do that. And so I was having a back and forth with two different deans in a way, as I was trying to, and I actually have that relationship with Whitney Matheson, where I'll write 2 pages of something. And then I'm saying, here, I've dropped the gauntlet into your lap. Now what? So she'll write it 2 pages back and then leave it in my hands. And we've written plays and had readings at theaters with some of the stuff that we've done. And we've written a screenplay recently that we hope to sell at some point. She's written some plays. It's great. It's fun to be around other collaborators because they kind of encourage you, or they challenge you to think differently, you know?
Well, let's talk about, so War of Wu is I don't know how to describe it. I'm looking at the website, but it's an exploration of violent and passionate relationships between Hollywood, heaven, and hell. And if I understand correctly, it's a sort of a prequel to the Red Hook graphic novels that you've done.
No, all right. So then originally when Phil was produced that, he wanted to connect it to my comics, which wasn't a bad idea because, it could then, and listen, at the end of the day, I probably am building some kind of weird universe of all these characters, kind of like what Tarantino does, they all kind of live in the Tarantino universe, or maybe even Frank Miller with his Sin City books and whatnot, and so I was trying to figure out, okay, and it was at his behest, at Phil's behest, that maybe come up with an idea. And I did write a version that connected it to the Red Hook universe, that maybe would be the launch of it somehow, right? At the end of the play, maybe launches. But then I realized this has nothing to do with the Red Hook. It doesn't. It was just me trying to figure out how to make it work so I could sell some graphic novels or something. Like it just didn't work. And so I convinced Phil that we would remove that aspect. And in fact, what was good about the pandemic was that 2 years gave me an opportunity to look at that play again. And I cut out 15 pages of that play. And then we actually made a short film of another scene that we cut out of the play that I think I've reinserted in maybe the version that you might have read. I don't remember. And use that as a way, it's kind of like a teaser trailer, cinematic teaser trailer to get people to want to go see the play, with Seth Gilliam and Phil Cruz, and directed by my buddy Shannon Goldman, who also produced it. And so, I had an opportunity to kind of revisit this idea, the War of Wu, kind of slim it down a little bit. And then in doing so, I realized, oh, this story actually has a different kind of like ideal to it. And again, I kind of shifted the ending a little bit, but I tried to honor the characters. I tried to honor the dilemma. I also was messing around with the idea of a horny female god who had a previous relationship with the devil, who actually is not such a bad guy, kind of a thing. And he still bamboozles people because he can't help himself. And then the idea that, well, that being on Earth is a worse hell than going to hell. That everybody has their own private hell, and how can they affect the afterlife? And the thing that's crazy is, I'm not religious. I don't believe in an afterlife, but I like the idea of one. I don't necessarily believe in resurrection or anything like that. So I was kind of toying with like these ideas and ideals, and trying to have some fun with it, but also in a loving way.
Well, and I think so a couple components is, one is that as my mom would say, out of the box, or as wacky or as quirky as all the ideas that you've just thrown out there are, especially for listeners who have no idea what War of Wu is, reading it and then seeing the short film and, getting a clear idea of what the play is, you have such a great knowledge of structure and the way in which you can plant seeds that seem like they have no connection to one another and then bring them together to be able to explore these ideas. So I want to recontextualize things a little bit, which is, in War of Woo, there's the short film, which will be available when this episode drops, is two guys who've known each other for a very long time walking to try to find their friend who's filming a movie, trying to make their way to set. And they're having a very sort of they're butting heads because they're having a playful conversation, and then they're also having a conversation about the way in which their sexual relations with other women have related to each other, and the fact that one guy has always felt like anytime he's expressed interest in somebody, his friend has gone and ruined that opportunity for him. And it's a really intense sequence that's also beautifully balanced out with references to pop culture and things like that. But the other thing that I think that it does is it demonstrates your understanding of the rhythm of language and Phil Cruz's understanding of the rhythm of language, that how he's going to handle your words, which I think is really cool. And then that story ends up taking itself to the film set, where it turns out that a demon is on set and is trying to become an actor, right? And is kind of messing with their friend Eugene that they're trying to find. And all of them end up getting together and having these weird existential moments where they need to figure out if they can bargain between heaven and hell. Like such a baffling, uncontrollable idea, Dean. And then on the page, I'm reading it and I'm like, holy crap, this works. Like, this is something that's functional. This is an experience that I'm having FOMO about, wishing I could be in Brooklyn to see a production of this, because I am understanding my moments reading it, literally laughing out loud by myself, and then thinking about how amplified that would be if somebody was, doing it. So I guess I want to make sure that I contextualize the fact that these are not superfluous ideas that you throw out into the universe and say, cool, here's the thing, check it out. These are like really well filtered and synthesized structures, no matter how bonkers the ideas are, that are then delivered to a Phil Cruz or another director to say, hey, let's see your interpretation.
Right, right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that rave. I mean, that is what I'm going for. And you're actually making me think, like, why do I do that? And I think it's because I'm trying to have fun when I'm writing, right? Like, sometimes you have an idea and you're like, oh, now I'm forcing. The minute you're forcing it, you got to edit it, take it out, have fun with it, because if you're having fun with it, hopefully other people will have fun, even just hearing it. I don't, even if it's performed deadpan or something, but yeah, I think sometimes what happens is like, well, I need to figure this thing out. Why am I bothered by this? I think sometimes you express yourself because you're just, this subject keeps lingering in your head, or this idea or whatever. And so I think that's part of being a creator, is kind of vomiting out some ideas and then trying to shape it. You shape the idea, right? And so I think one of the things I learned from some of my favorite movies and plays and stuff is, well, it's twofold. Either you reference stuff that people know, and then unfortunately it dates the piece, or you try to go evergreen and you try to talk in broader terms about, let's say, pop culture references or something, so that 100 years from now, somebody can still understand what the hell you're talking about, But I think at the end of the day, I could throw out 40 different, pop culture references in 5 minutes, but what's underneath it is evergreen, is an existential crisis or an issue, like issues of romance is going to be evergreen until the end of time, issues of territory, loyalty, like dreams, evergreen, what makes us tick, evergreen, and then when you put here, I'll give you a play idea right now. Okay, I'm sorry to use a gun again, and I haven't written this, although I'm writing something new that might incorporate this idea, is you put six strangers in a room and you put a gun in the middle of the room. There, go. Now what? What? Who's the person that's afraid of guns? Who's the first person to reach for the gun? Who are these people? And why is there a gun in the middle of the room, and what's happening, and why don't they know each other, and then figure all that stuff out. And like, that's just a basic premise right there, because then you have an opportunity to write six different people, and who knows why maybe someone's a plant, maybe there's a revenge, maybe, who knows. Go write something, go have some fun. So sometimes a premise is great to play with, and then you discover your characters, and then you start to discover, you know what, I was pissed off at that thing on social media the other day. I might try to incorporate that. Or I had a conversation with my mom where she brought up this thing when I was 4 years old. How can I make connections? And that's something, like you said, I go all over the place, right? And somehow I make the connections. That's my greatest weakness in some ways, is the fact that I could fly off the handle. And then I try to figure out how to put it together in a way that you didn't see it coming, or it felt like, oh, that's why that was there. When, trust me, it didn't start out that way. So that's part of the creative process.
I want to go back to this idea of premise real quick, and I want to share a little anecdote that I had been meaning to tell you, which was, so I used to teach middle school and high school computer science, and now I teach college. But one of my former middle schoolers is now a graduating senior, which is just terrifying. And they do this senior thesis project or this capstone project, and I was invited to go see these presentations. And one of my students had decided that on top of being a remarkably successful dancer and academic and all these different things, that she wanted to get into playwriting. And she spent her entire senior year doing a capstone, just seeing how she could write and do plays. And like, these are high school students with limited resources. And she was trying to come up with a premise and was thinking about, like, okay, what is a place that a 16, 17, 18-year-old will be able to experience conflict and personalities that butt heads, and places where people, like, where time is of the essence and all these things. And she came up with this amazing idea of, like, what if I do a play about a bunch of people in an escape room? And she got her cast together and took them to an escape room locally, and they did the escape room together as this sort of like
an improv thing at first.
Not even improv. I think it was just like her going and being observational and seeing how people respond, and getting, and also buying in to all these other potential actors saying, like, oh, this is cool. Like, I want to be a part of this process. And then she went home and wrote this play, and then, performed it with a small group and whatnot. But it was just taking a simple premise. What is something that people do? I mean, in the modern equivalent is like, my office job wants to make sure that we don't hate each other. Let's eat pizza and go to an escape room. But that was, I thought, such a brilliant way to come up with a simple concept, just as your, six people with a gun example. Like, for anybody who's interested in playwriting, like, Dean, I think you've done a great job of just explaining that, like, you just write the thing and then see what happens and understand what resources you have. But once you come up with the premise and you give yourself permission to explore the premise on paper, you've become a playwright.
Well, I mean, basically, I'm an inadvertent playwright until I decided to to write plays. And even it's weird to even call myself a playwright, because I feel like there are playwrights out there that do it all the time. And like you said, don't even get their stuff produced most of the time, right? So I guess it's good to have friends who are talented and believe in me, number one, because, and listen, I've had to change things with producers, directors, and they're like, that's not working. Let's revisit this. And I've had some good edits and good notes, and sometimes I fight against it and sometimes I agree. I've had actors say, I can't say this line. Like, what are you doing here? What's this line? And I'll think about it, I go, yeah, we don't need that. That's okay. I also, again, I have a healthy ego, but also I'm smart. Like, if it works better the other way, let's go the other way, because it works better. It's not mine anymore. I wrote mine. I think William Goldman, fantastic screenwriter, used to say that when he finally put the last period on the screenplay, he had written his movie. His movie was done. Now he's handing it to a director who's going to have actors and editors, and they're going to make something else, with the same material. And it's kind of a sense of interpretation or adaptation, But yeah, I do love it. And then after the War of Wu, you take a little break. You go, are we going to do this again somehow? And I revisited that play that I threw away. I gutted half of it, and I started looking at the part that I did like, and then I had a better understanding of what I think I was going for. I just wasn't ready for it. And I've written a new play that then I was thinking, well, maybe this would be the one I direct. I don't know. But even so, now that I've had some distance from it again, I might go back in and do some more editing, because it was a tough one to try to figure out, and it's a simpler one in some ways, but also encapsulates some of my abstract and absurdity that you just have to, like, kind of like when you're reading the War Wu. At first you're like, this is not, how could, and then no, it works. It just, because I figured it out, hopefully, and you agree, like you buy in, and so that's kind of where I like that sweet spot. To me, there's a sweet spot of reality and irreality, and that's kind of what I do in my comics. And in fact, if you want to get into Kickstarter, my third Kickstarter, the Red Hook X or Times or by Dean Haspiel is the title, is me futzing around with memoir and superhero. I've combined the two genres into one. And, one could say that Peter Parker and Spider-Man is already doing that, which is something I cite and inspired by, because, he has to fight the Green Goblin, but he also has to get milk and eggs for his Aunt May, and how do you do both? And then you tell the story so he becomes relatable. And, we're not superheroes, but we could be Peter Parker, or we could be, any character that has duality, right? And so I was like, well, we live in a world right now that is desperate to immerse themselves. We have self-entitled fans who want to tell you how to do the franchise because you're doing the franchise wrong. We have so many critics and so many people telling other people what to do and wanting to immerse with cosplay and everything else. I was like, why don't I put myself in my own comic book? And I've kind of done it over the years, but not as blatantly as saying, hi, this is Dean Haspiel in New Brooklyn at the bar with the Red Hook, right? I'm not going to get into the story, but I decided how would that work? And I'm not doing this. I will tell you this. It's not like, well, Red Hook, I am your creator. I'm not doing that. We've seen that before, and who cares, right? I just happen to be in the bar for certain reasons, and there's a whole other bunch of stuff that happens in this story. So it's not just about me being in the same space as a creation. I feel like one of the tenets that I always follow in my own work is it has to be a love story. I love love stories. So it has to have a little bit of sense of romance, and there's that in as well. And if we go back to Kickstarters, I started Kickstarter with COVID Cop because one of the things that we do as creators is we react to the world, right? And what's happening. And I'd already done like a 4-page Red Hook story where it was my story about first responders during the pandemic, right? So it was kind of a serious story, even though it had a superhero in it, my superhero in Brooklyn. But then I was like, well, I'm going to take the piss out of the pandemic. And, I love characters like Mad Max, Judge Dredd, Toxic Avenger. I was like, why don't I create my own character like that and come up with a premise that, again, I won't explain here. You can go online and read a little bit about COVID Cop. And I tried to pitch it to publishers. And the good news is a lot of publishers are like, this is actually pretty good. The bad news is like, there's no way we will ever publish this. Why? Because it's called COVID and Cop, 2 words that people don't really love, and you put them together, And trust me, I was at Ithacon, I was at Motor City Comic Con, I've done Brooklyn shows, Brooklyn Independent Comic Show, BIX, and I get a lot of reactions where people are polarized by looking at the cover of this comic book, right? Although weirdly enough, Motor City Comic Con, they ate it up. I sold a lot of COVID Cops. Anyway, so I decided to do my first Kickstarter and say, let me try to enter this realm because I am kind of aging out. I never was the popular Marvel DC artist. I've just dabbled at Marvel and DC. And the majority of my work has been kind of independent and or webcomic based, that we either get print versions of, or I was like the indie guy that was allowed to play with the mainstream toys, you know? And when I realized that early on in my career is when I started to create my own characters like Billy Dogman, Jane Legit, the Red Hook that I did at Webtoon for about 6 years. I did like almost 5 seasons, which you can go read right now for free on Webtoon. And you know, other characters. And so I decided, why don't I try to steer and into my own path and continue to carve that path through the tools that we are given today, like crowdfunding, newsletters, social media, right? And just somehow employ all that and try to figure out how to make a living that way. Now, I'm not making a big living, I'm just squeaking by, but I'm still doing what I love and not having to get, quote, a real job. Although my job is 24/7. A real job might be 9 to 5, probably not, especially with remote and everything else. But you maybe can put your job behind and go to a barbecue, right? At the barbecue, I'm thinking about the next page or the next issue or what you're doing creatively and trying to rally you, you know, because we need to support each other, you know, constantly.
Well, one of the things that I heard, I love this. You need to make T-shirts, my friend. Which is your new life tagline is you're trying to lean into the Dean,
Oh, lean into
right?
deep.
Lean into Dean. And I think it's interesting just in the sense that like for people who are kind of unfamiliar with you, they Google Dean Haspiel and it's going to say Ringo and Emmy award-winning independent cartoonist.
Right.
And I've always associated with you for the decades I've been reading your work as this independent guy, but I had never thought about the idea, at least until recently, that like, okay, he's independent and he's doing something for Webtoon. He's independent, he's doing something for Vertigo. He's independent, he's doing something for this publisher that's known for highlighting independent creators and giving them more of a voice than they would normally have if they worked for these major companies. And now you've taken it to the extent where it's like you're the editorial process, you're the book designer, you're the colorist, you're doing all of these aspects, and maybe you're farming out different pieces of the work, but you are the project manager, you're the marketer, you're the one overseeing all elements of production and marketing and just getting the word out there through these Kickstarter models. And I feel like that term independent now carries a much more significant and different weight to it than it did 5 or 6 years ago.
You know, that's an interesting, I never even thought about that. The fact that, like, you know, when you think about 1980s black and white comics, they call them, right? And I loved those black, and I was a contributor. In 1987, I did a comic called The Verdict, a 4-issue miniseries for Eternity Comics, written by Martin Powell, led by Patrick Brousseau, I believe. And yeah, that was truly independent. It felt indie, it felt alternative, it felt not necessarily underground, but underground adjacent. Whereas independent today might feel like more galvanizing than ever before, right? So, I mean, actually, Archie Comics technically is an independent comic book publisher, right? Whereas Marvel and DC are owned by bigger corporations now, you know, but they started off as basically independent and then became mainstream or popular. But yeah, I didn't even think about the fact that independent might be a marketing term that helps sell the work, that it feels independent. It feels, you know, it's almost like artisanal, although I don't really like the word artisanal, but I've used it, right? And people understand what that means, you know? It means that you are a one-stop shop, or you're allying with other people. Like I was just having a conversation last night with my buddy Charlie McElvey, who is the publisher and writer at Zion Comics, and my buddy Vito Del Sante, who I've worked with, who co-created and wrote The Purple Heart for my New Brooklyn series. And we've all been talking about the fact, and he has a character called Stray. And we all have, like, I have the Red Hook, Vito has Stray, Charlie has Spider Squirrel and Trash Panda, you know? But we all love our old Marvel and DC comics, but we're doing our own Marvel and DC comics, let's call it, right? In that independent way. And people are craving, you know, when you get a hunger, you know, people who read go to bookstore every week or comics every week, you know, movies. And like, I have a certain hunger for story, you know, so I'm constantly indulging story as much as possible because I'm always learning from it, but I'm also being entertained by it, you know? And I'm taking notes. I'm like, that doesn't work. Oh, that totally works. Or I could never do that. I love when I'm intimidated, because to me there's still a magic to storytelling, and but independent, I love that you kind of made me start thinking how that's a good buzzword. Sometimes I used to think of it as, well, we're independent, which means we're not as good as, but maybe independent is better than, you know? I don't know. There's a way to look at it that way.
Absolutely, and I think all of them need to exist.
True.
I've heard you use the term artisanal. I want to put another word in your vernacular, which is I almost think about the comics that you're publishing as being more boutique, in the idea that
Yeah.
there's, to me, artisanal is about the craft, which all of your stuff is, but boutique in the sense that like you need to be in the right place, right time to experience it.
Right.
Uh, which ironically, the Kickstarter mentality kind of has a theater mentality, in the sense that like, well, if I'm not there for this part, there's probably going to be a lag before I, as the person with the fear of missing out, will be able to jump on the bandwagon again and get the
Right.
second run or the third run of this type
Right.
of book.
Let me just say one thing about boutique, because I agree with you. And I think Top Shelf used to call itself a boutique publisher, and where you get a certain sensibility and it feels like off to the side, but there was enough of an audience for it, right? And it grew. Um, it's not that I don't want to become mainstream, because I would love to be mainstream. And I mean that not in the sense of watered down and neutered, uh, let's say, product or creativity, but more in that appeal, that I'm somehow appealing to a wide, because guess what? The more I appeal, the better quality of life I might be living. And maybe I can rest a little bit here and there. Maybe I won't have to worry as much about next month's rent, kind of a thing. So please, I would love to sell out a little bit, as it were, right? Whereas boutique is proper and true. And I just think, like, my good friend Nick Bertozzi, who teaches at SVA, School of Visual Arts Comic, he teaches comics there, with my other buddy Josh Neufeld, and a ton of other people I know, Jason Little, all these people that used to be studio mates. When he lived with me, and I'm in the room where my art table was when he lived here, and he was in the room next to me right now, an open space. He had a note on his art table that said, "Live like a rat, be a rat." And nothing against rats, because my girlfriend had many rats, and I learned to love rats. And I have cats, and we were always saving pigeons and everything else. He was like, "No, if you live small, you're going to stay small. So have horizons, think outside the box, think ahead." And that's something I've never done, because what comics taught me when I was younger was that where I could maybe reach an audience was a newsstand. And then there was the invention of the comic book shop, which in a weird way kind of isolated it and quarantined comics, because you could get some comics in the newsstand. Now we don't have any of these things. Well, we have comic book shops. But we used to be like, you might be able to find an Archie Digest at the grocery store. I don't know. Or I don't know, are there 7-Elevens? There are 7-Elevens, right? I don't think there are comic books there anymore, but whatever. But the idea that to my heights, the sights that I set were very low budget, very, very attainable. Okay. And I think some people, I don't know, let's use Beyonce. Maybe she set him so high that she got there, or Taylor Swift, or like, they're incredible industry, these people, because they set their sights high. Like, I have never set my sights higher than what was attainable. And as I start to get older, maybe there's one more leg of this life where maybe I could shoot a little bit higher, so that I can live a less anxious life.
Fair. I so I guess one more question about Kickstarter, and then we'll kind of wrap things up, which is just tell me about the response that you've gotten from running these campaigns. I mean, a lot of people, I mean, on this show, actually, I've had people who have come on to talk about campaigns that have been successful or unsuccessful, but you're 3 for 3, my friend. Like, people are responding to your work with their pocketbooks. How does it feel to, go through all means of distribution, all means of manufacturing and then get that work into people's hands, knowing that it is almost the purest sense of Dean Haspiel.
Well, thank you. And it truly is that, again, warts and all, whether you like it or not. I mean, I guess that's what people are buying into. I think part of the crowdfunding world is that you're supporting an artist and understanding that that's what's happening, at least for certain artists. Some people know how to really figure out Kickstarter and create and grow and create an industry where they're just like, they have a staff. I don't have a staff. I have a studio mate who helps me with a lot of stuff. And then, in fact, around 1 o'clock in about 15 minutes, I have a phone call with my buddy Josh Neufeld, who's a great cartoonist, because he's assembled my book in InDesign, and we're going to go pull the trigger on printing this Red Hook book, this afternoon. So it'll take a week or two to have all these boxes come to my studio. I sit down at a table and I package and I mail each book to the people who responded, And the thing is this, I try to keep it, my tip is try to keep it attainable. Like, there can be some high priced tiers, where you may be making a drawing or something for somebody. But essentially, I'm selling a comic book. But I'm not selling a comic book you can buy in a comic book shop, which is, I would love to get into the comic store. I just don't know how financially it could work out for me. So I've given some comic book shops that I go to and admire, I just hand them comic books. I say, here, thank you. Just put this out there and see if it sells. Just take it, But to work with distribution means that they're cutting the price, the cover price, in half. You're probably not even getting that, but they're cutting in half, and then you're also having paid for the printer and all kinds of stuff. So you're making about $1 or $2 if you put that into the comic book shop. So right now it is a comic that comes to your mailbox or to your doorstep, right? But I am losing the impulse buy. I'm losing that relationship with comic book shops, right? And I need to figure out in the future how to serve that aspect of being, quote, a publisher. I didn't think I'd become a publisher. I call these Dean Haspiel deep cuts, and it is kind of like how I feel is what they are, is getting something from me that we wouldn't necessarily get at a comic book shop, or maybe you would, I don't know. It's not like it's that special, but but it is that different, coming from me, as illustrated by our conversation today about the type of things I like to write and draw, and the plays I create. So I don't know. I think that the reaction has been great, but obviously you want more, because what's cool is when people come back and they want the next thing. I was like, that's fantastic. And I think I want to honor that in my next Kickstarter that I'll do, like a 4th one, where I give a certificate to those who have been there for the long haul, kind of a thing. But you also want word of mouth. You want people to be like, okay, what is this thing? Like, what's he got next? And be able to offer previous, things that I've Kickstarted before. So I'm still learning. I'm still green at this. But the fact that I've been able to basically make a living at this in the last year and a half is crazy. But again, just enough to squeak by, and again, I'm not trying to be, I've never set a higher goal, as I was talking about before, about 5 minutes before. I'd like to live a better quality of life. And I don't know if crowdfunding will take me there, but I always say you got to show up to your own party. So I got to lean into Dean, see what happens. And hopefully you will too, because I know I'm leaning into other people all the time,
Yeah. Well, so just to wrap this up, Dean, where can people find you on social media?
They can find me on Instagram, Dean Haspiel _art. I'm on Facebook, Dean Haspiel. Substack. I would love to get more Substack people, because that's where I get to write some stuff and tell people what I'm doing, what I'm up to. Is Dean Haspiel Substack. And that's basically the 3 things I use. Blue Sky, I don't even understand. I was never good at Twitter and Blue Sky, or X, whatever they call it now. I'm there, but it's piddly. And otherwise, I did get to an Etsy store. So my first 2 Kickstarters, COVID Cop, and then the second one was Billy Dogma and Jane Legit, which is more of an adult themed comic, is up at Etsy. You can also find me on Substack or write to me, and we could do PayPal or Venmo if people are interested in my comics. And then hopefully I'll be packaging and shipping the third Kickstarter, the Red Hook X Dean Haspiel, in a few weeks, and that'll be out in the world. And yeah, I take these books to shows. Like that's the majority of what I'm trying to sell is the new stuff, the stuff you can only get from me, you know. And yes, I try to bring a couple other things that like the Fox or maybe some other graphic novel I worked on. But right now, I'm really trying to like promote the thing that you can only get from me at a show. So maybe it is artisanal, boutique, whatever, you know. And will that become more popular and blow up? I don't know. We'll see.
I love it. And I always want to make space for just anything that's on your brain, anything we haven't tackled. Is there anything on your mind or anything that you want to kind of get out there before we wrap up?
God, I just appreciate this conversation. I mean, I'm sure there's 10 other topics we could talk about, but I appreciate this conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to actually indulge some of my work and actually have opinions and a response, and in luckily a favorable way, you know, and to have that kind of tolerance, because we're all pretty lazy and we just like to know, oh, you're the guy that does that thing and she's the person that does that thing, and I'm all over the place. And the fact that you're able to make those connections and stick with it, I truly appreciate.
Well, awesome, Dean. Well, it's been a delight to have you on the show. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
I hope you had half as much fun as I did leaning into Dean. That was a wonderful conversation, and I just loved seeing the way in which his comics led into playwriting and his sort of DIY ethic of playwriting led into self-publishing. And just with that, I can't wait to see what's going to happen next. I'm also completely incapable of looking at Zach Galifianakis without just thinking that he's actually really Dean Haspiel in disguise. Could be both. You never know. Dean Haspiel might have been in the Hangover movies. Who knows? Dean, thanks so much for being on the show. And if you are interested in Dean's work, please go check out his Etsy. Please go follow him on social media. Check out his Substack. Make sure that you're giving him as much support as you can, because the more we do, the higher the chance we have of seeing more work appear on stage. As he said, these are passion projects. They are not commercially viable, but art is valuable, and let's support that. If you are interested in learning more about other cool artists, please check out the back catalog of Meditations with Ryan Zlomek. On episode 3, we talk about the culture of food with Dave Foreman. On episode 5, I talk with the voice of Bob the Builder, Mark Silk. On episode 10, we talk with stop-motion animator Tim Allen, who worked on Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio and Wes Anderson's Fantastic Mr. Fox and Isle of Dog. On episode 17, Julie Sellers talks about creative business strategies and what it's like to guide artists to figure out how to be financially viable. On episode 19, Nate Powell talks about punk rock in relation to him doing his sort of social justice oriented comic books. And then one of my personal favorites, on episode 21, Tim Jacobus comes on the show. He was the illustrator for all the Goosebumps covers in the 1990s Goosebumps series by R.L. Stine. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the creative procedures of artists, please check out the back catalog, rate, review, subscribe to the podcast. There's more cool stuff coming up, including our next episode with the one, the only Kent Sutherland. Kent Sutherland is an app developer who owns a company called Flexibits, focuses specifically on productivity software, and kind of gives us this awesome background perspective on what it's like to develop software for smartphones, for VR devices, for smart watches, and just thinking about the way in which app developers can be, if they choose to, tasked with the challenge of actually making life easier and more effective and more helpful for the user, as opposed to just, stealing our data and stealing our souls at the same time. So if you are interested in that, please subscribe to the show. Kent Sutherland is coming up in just 2 weeks, and I am over the moon for it. You can find The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook and on Instagram. There's some more cool social media channels coming up. But once again, if you liked the show, please spread the word, because if you make space for conversation, you just might learn something. Thanks so much for all your support. I look forward to hearing from you soon.